Like I said, this is going to be pretty similar to last week. I'm going to cover some recent API additions and feature additions. We'll keep things mostly to do-gooder, although I think I might hop over to process the basics a little bit. But I'm going to kind of go through four features in particular. The first is kind of a back-end addition that happened recently after some conversations with Ray. And it's fairly simple, but it's basically a way to do cache busting. So you've probably all had the experience, you push something up and the client still has the stale cache and they have to do a hard refresh on the specific page where the new functionality is to get it to come in. And we've had a technique that we've used for a long time for dealing with that particular problem, which is basically prefixing the URL with some kind of build signifier that breaks the cache when you push a new build. And the way that we do that from a technical perspective is just using a little mod rewrite rule. So when you look in the htaccess here, it's going to say if we start with cache followed by an arbitrary string followed by a slash, strip that off before passing it on to Apache. So it's relatively simple in that regard. And then the tricky part is always, remembering to update that tag and getting that integrated into your build process. You'll notice in do-gooder here, I've got basically a timestamp as my cache busting prefix. So if I hit refresh, it's going to change every single time. And that's nice so that when you're in development, you never have to worry about the cache getting in the way of testing a new feature. When you're going into production, though, you don't want to change every time. You just want to change when you push a new build. So for that, there's a command that's built in now, this build metadata command, which writes out to a file with a timestamp. So in the case of PTB, you can see there's a Dewdrop build.php. All that has is the timestamp. And then in my Bootstrap for process the basics, I am just tying that in my define view method. So here I'm saying my view's URL cache prefix is whatever the Dewdrop build resource is from Pimple. And that's either going to be that file in production and staging or a timestamp when you're in development. So it kind of does that logic for you. So there are a few things you have to add to a project if you want to use this feature, but it's relatively straightforward. The reason I didn't do it by default is you have to have your htaccess a certain way and you have to have your URL set up a certain way, or you'll start getting weird breakages. So if you want to opt into that for your project, it's add this to your view Bootstrap, add the htaccess stuff, which is in the documentation, and add to your deploy script that little thing that will update the information every time you're pushing. So that's cache busting. Like I said, relatively straightforward, but it helps a lot when you're pushing stuff out for clients to review and things like that. The next thing is kind of going off of what we talked about last week, which is the new mail queuing system that I'm using in Do-Gooder. I've pushed that a little bit further and added some features. The main feature we're going to talk about in it is this ability to request that a volunteer applicant, so let me just throw in some info here, request that they edit their application. So I can say, I want them to update their application, and when they're updating it, they're allowed to edit these fields. So let's say, I don't know, we need the shirt size and their essay updated. We can hit send, and that's going to queue the message. And this is actually one of the things that's kind of nice about this queuing system is it's not going to send anything until you run that cron job in the background. So when you're working in development, there's less complexity when it comes to test modes and things like that, because it's not actually sending until you run that cron. So in my case, I don't really need to run the cron typically. I can just go over here and view, what message was sent. And then also in the case of this new feature where we're editing their application, it's going to show you the link that they would have been given to do that application edit inside the UI. So that lets me test that aspect of it too. So if I open up this person's link and then see like I've got a stripped down version of the application that I can work on. And actually in this case, they're not allowed to write an essay because this is a general volunteer. So it just says the shirt size. So that's a nice little feature for do-gooder in particular, because a lot of times they need adjustments to people's applications, and this lets them do that without giving the person free rein to change everything. It's just these specific things we need updated. So from a code perspective, this really piggybacks on what we talked about last week, but it illustrates a concept that some of you are probably somewhat unfamiliar with, and that's referencing field objects from the database. So it's pretty obvious like how to work with the fields and code. If you've done like component definitions and things like that and Dewdrop admins, you've seen that many times. But it's different when you want to store some selection of fields. So in this case, which fields they're allowed to edit in their application is actually stored here in email application edit fields. So let's first look at the most recent email message. You see we're dealing with email message 27. And we can see that essentially what we're storing is the message ID and then the field, what's actually the field ID or control name. And when we're storing that, there's obviously a chance that things could become out of sync. So your code could change in the sense that you're like adding or removing fields, or your database could change. And you need this to happen in kind of a safe way. So the way that you pull this off, and you'll see this in a lot of Dewdrop code, is by writing your loop in such a way that you're basically saying, like, if the field still exists in the field's configuration, then we're going to add this. So we're actually going to look back at the main application page here. So the first thing you'll see is we're doing some extra authorization checks in this case. So let's pull one of these links up again. You'll notice we've got this volunteer ID, so that's automatically going to load the application for us. But we've also got this key afterward. And this is a pattern we use in a lot of our applications. But essentially, we're just saying, is there a message out there that has this volunteer ID and key and hasn't already been used? If not, then we send them over to a thanks page automatically that just says, hey, we already got your updated application. Good to go. Don't worry about it. But if we do have that, then we hold on to that message so we can use it to figure out which fields are allowed. So at that point, we are going to be looping through our fields and our view script. Let's actually start in the model. If we go into our email message, we see that we can here fetch the authorized edit fields. And then we're grabbing that here as well. So these are the fields that the person's actually authorized to edit. So then we loop over all of the available fields, so everything they could be editing, and we say, if the control name of the available field is in the array of authorized field IDs, then we're going to add it to our collection that the person's allowed to use right now. So we're essentially filtering the main set down to anything that happens to match what's in the database. So if the database had a field that has since been removed or anything like that, it doesn't matter. We'll just be skipping over it. So that's kind of how you can safely reference a field in your database without worrying about it. becoming out of sync with your code. One little note on the generation of those keys. It's one of those things that's kind of tricky to do sometimes in PHP, to generate like a cryptographically strong random value. There are a lot of built-in PHP functions for randomness, like rand or mtrand. And if you look closely on the documentation for them, I believe they both say, yeah, these aren't really used for cryptographic cases. So, this is only for, I don't know, writing like a poker game or something silly where the randomness doesn't quite matter. The API that they recommend in the documentation is this OpenSSL function. We've used that before, but on these Silex projects, there's actually a nice little wrapper that comes from the Symfony project called Secure Random, which comes from the Symfony security component. And the thing that's nice about this is it will do a fallback for you if OpenSSL is not available, and it'll also just make sure everything's set up correctly. So let's hop into that real quick. You can see this next bytes method is the main thing you're going to be calling. And at first we'll attempt SSL, but then it kind of does something that's decent if it doesn't have OpenSSL available. So it's kind of nice to have. The main way you use it to actually generate one of these keys is to just get a number of bytes from it. So I'm just grabbing 12 bytes and then passing that to the bin to hex function from PHP, which will just convert the binary value that the Symfony component's giving you into a hexadecimal value, which is nice for passing around in URLs and things like that. So that's worth noting. So that's one big feature, is having the ability to reference a field in the database and then pull that up to kind of have persistence on a code level. The next thing is the actual scheduling in Do-Gooder 3. So creating shifts, assigning volunteers to them. And this is an example of doing backbone code. So it's very similar to a lot of stuff we did on PTV. I'm just going to kind of run through a couple of the concepts really quick as it relates to newer stuff in Dewdrop. So one example of functionality here is the ability to kind of pull up different lists of volunteers. So I can see everyone who's available for this shift as an example. As I'm doing that, I'm actually going back to the server each time. So if I hit the assigned button here, we see that I hit the server and send back a JSON response. And I mentioned this last week, but one of the nice little additions recently is that for doing JSON responses in your code, you can now just return an array directly from your render method, and it'll set up the headers and all of that for you to send the JSON that way. So you don't have to do that yourself. It's just something that's easy to make mistakes on. So that's in place here. One of the other aspects that I thought is worth pointing out about this particular feature is just adding multiple AJAX methods to your collection classes and your backbone stuff. So as an example, I've got like a specific method for assigning a volunteer, removing a volunteer. Similarly for shifts, whenever someone is assigned or removed from a shift, I don't try to track that client side to figure out, for example, what this count should be, what all 4 of these counts should be, and so on. I actually just ask the server again, hey, what should these counts be? And that way I don't have to figure out, if I remove myself from this shift, that should decrement the confirmed count here. But I don't really want to have to figure all that out client side, because I might not have access to all the data about these other volunteers on the shift at all times. So this makes it a lot simpler to just say, when that changes, I want to ask the server to just update those stats. And that's happening here in the shift view. I'm just saying, whenever the assigned status on the volunteer collection changes, call the refresh stats method. which ultimately is going to be hitting this right here. So it's just kind of an easy way to maintain that state without having to have all these components on the client side talking to each other too much. Next step out, actually one more thing on this is for anyone doing autocompletes and searches in their backbone code, there's a technique in client-side UI that's kind of important called debouncing. And that's basically waiting a certain amount of time to see if they're going to hit another key before you send the AJAX request to get the results. And underscore, very helpfully, has a utility built in for debouncing. You'll see here my initialized method for shift view. I'm creating a debounced version of my search method. And that essentially is saying, if I don't get a second event, so a second key press within 300 milliseconds, then go ahead and perform the search. Otherwise, cancel the previous one and start a 300 millisecond timer when the second key is pressed. And that way I'm kind of throttling the number of requests that I'm sending to the server. That can get kind of important for this kind of thing, just to make sure that you're getting consistent results displayed to the user. So I wanted to point that out too. And then the final aspect that I think is pretty applicable to other projects is we added a new security level that's an assistant coordinator. So you can see by default, the user creation page here just has the standard stuff from the Dewdrop authentication module, or auth module, I guess. But if I pick assistant coordinator, I get this additional option where I can say, limit them to specific teams. And this is important because they've got a lot of people at True False and other festivals and things like that who are in charge of a specific team, but they don't know the system as a whole. And you don't really want them kind of going into areas that they don't really understand and messing things up. So we've got this new login role, which I've created an example of, that gets a much more limited view of the application. So you can see a lot of the areas of the app are completely hidden from me. I can only see 2 volunteers because I can only see the people on my team. I can't add a new volunteer. And even if I'm filtering, so I want to filter by team, my options are limited to the ones that were selected. And then similarly for shifts, I can only see things that are assigned to my teams. So the way this works, we did some of this in PTB, but this is maybe taking it a little bit further in a couple of areas, is first, for the components that you don't want available to everybody, you can set their access permission to specific roles. So in this case, admin and coordinator are allowed to access the applicant's component. So you've seen that in a lot of places. So settings would be another one where you're not allowed to see it at all if you're an assistant coordinator. If you're a volunteer, or the volunteers component though, we want them to be able to access it. We're just going to limit what they can do, what they can see. So this is kind of similar to the store filter in PTB. I've got a team access filter class that's going to basically provide utilities for modifying various database queries to fit with this filter. And I found that having this kind of utility class can be very helpful for this kind of feature. So we can see here in the constructor, all we're saying is, if we've got an assistant who's logged in, then figure out what their team whitelist is. So you just get that set of team IDs. And then we've got a variety of methods to modify different types of SQL statements based on that whitelist. So in the case of a listing, you see that we've got like a modify volunteer listing method. And what that's going to do is add a filter to that listing that says, where the volunteer ID is in the volunteer IDs that match these teams. So that kind of builds that for me. So you see that being dropped in right here. And then another aspect of this is down in my field definition. You can see that I'm filtering the option pairs. So I want to modify option pairs on each of these team-related fields. And that's going to change the SQL query for fetching the option pairs to filter it by that team whitelist. Similarly, on shifts, doing the same basic things, modifying option pairs on a couple things, and then modifying the main listing. And then finally, we don't want them to be able to edit the teams for volunteers because they're supposed to be kind of limited to what they were assigned. So this is another case where instead of just saying set editable true or false, we can say set editable and then an array of roles, and that will remove that field from this person's view of the edit form. One of the things that's nice about that is when you're using the grouped fields, like we have here, so they're grouped into tabs, it'll automatically hide a tab that has no fields visible inside of it. So in this case, we're not even seeing the two teams tabs that we would normally see up top here. So that's, again, a very easy way of saying, for this security level, you can do this on a field, and for this security level, you can do this on that same field. Which makes this type of thing a lot simpler than it was in Zen Framework applications. I think that's it for the stuff this week. Any questions on any of that? Cool. Well, I will throw this one into Basecamp. And
I like the grouping.
yeah, the groupings come in really handy. It's nice to not have to think about that. It's just all in the GUI now. So